Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 3. This week, we are going to really start looking at the guidelines in our manual, and we are going to continue coding throughout the ICD 10 CM book as well. Before we get into that, let's go over the questions from last week's reflection. So, the first question is if I'm struggling with the class or having trouble understanding certain topics or concepts, are there tutoring options available? I want to make sure I'm using all the resources available to stay on track. So, yes, I have office hours on Monday at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time via Teams. There is also tutor.com that is listed in each of the courses. You can ask the tutors on there. They are available 24/7. However, be careful with working with them. They are going to provide you the process and even sometimes give you the answer, but they are not coders and they are not necessarily going to give you the correct answer. So while it is helpful to go to tutor.com for processes, it is not helpful for getting answers. So if you do talk to them, again, just be aware that even if they do provide you answers, they're not necessarily going to be correct. My recommendation for everyone is to work on the practice from the book. There is one student that has been doing this well, I can't say each week because it's only really been a week, but they worked on the practice in chapter 2 and they sent me an email of what they had completed, and then I let them know if they were right or they were wrong. That's the best way to do it. Particularly if you're stuck and not sure of one, doing one in practice with the steps from our course with that document that I printed out. Um, that will help you kind of understand the process. All right, next question. I'm having trouble locating the ICD form that you showed in lecture. I'm not sure if it's just me, but I cannot locate it. I am seeing a download for it in the lecture. I was, oh, okay. So let's go to the actual course. And this is not the course. Let me go to our course. Okay, so let me go to student preview. All right, so everything that you need is in the announcements. So if you went to week 2, you would find here it says ICD 10 outline to find a code blank. You go over to this 3 dots and hit download, and that will download the form that you need to, or you don't need to, but this is the form that I ask you to use when you have a question about an answer from an assignment or even a practice. So, like I said previously, all of the information you're going to need for this course is always going to be posted, like the new information is always going to be posted in the announcements. Now, I can see how many of those have read the announcements, so it is important that you make sure that you do that because I can check and see who has looked at it and who hasn't. And again, this is where your lectures are going to be posted, any updated information that I want to post and talk about, all of that is listed in our announcements. I don't post anything additional into the content. All right, so the next question was that last week's video was labeled 142 and one instead of 143. Um, that's a great I like to catch that. That's something we need to do in coding. It was just a misprint type of the keyboard. Doesn't mean anything. All right, next question. this student had a question about Hashimoto's disease and which one you would look under as the main term. So this goes into the conventions and the definitions of that in chapter 2 and 3. So Hashimoto's is an eponym. It was named after somebody. So if it is an eponym, that is always going to be your main term. How do we know it's an eponym? Well, you'll know it because in the medical record it will begin with a capital letter, meaning it's named after somebody's last name or somebody's first name. Lou Gehrig's disease, Hashimoto's. There's quite a few other ones, but you always go by eponym first. You may be able to look through disease, and disease can be the main term for other items, but when it's an eponym trumps the finding it the way of a disease. Okay, next question. Can I show another example how to complete a diagnosis that requires multiple codes? Yes, I plan on doing that this week after we talk about the questions. However, if there are specific examples that you want me to go over, you need to provide those to me. So provide examples with the form completed that you would like me to review or go over. Next question. What should I do if I'm unsure about a coding convention or guideline? So the first thing that you'll want to do is you'll want to take a look in our 321 Code It book, the textbook, because that will give you a little bit of a different spin on the terminology of the convention or the guideline. We can also currently, Google it. But I would much rather you ask in the reflection or email. Remember, the best way to get a hold of me is kberge@sullivan.edu. Would it be possible to see the homework and quiz answers to see what mistakes I've made and learn from them? So the coding assignments, you will see the answers after the due date. The quizzes and midterm and final exam, the answers are not posted to keep the integrity of the assignment. All right, the next question. Can you please give more examples on how to find the term? I seem not to be able to understand it. So, anytime you are looking for the main term, you are looking for why the patient was being seen. And we'll look at that in the two examples I have to go over in a few minutes. But there is usually going to be that main term or that main reason of why the patient is there. And then the subterms are going to describe the why. So, for example, let me let me just grab one. Hang on one second. Okay, so we have a couple of diagnostic statements here. Let's start with this first one, streptococcal peritonitis. So we need to figure out the main reason, and that will be our main term. and that is why the patient came, and then any subterms that describe the why. So, would it be okay to say that the patient was there for streptococcal? No, because streptococcal what? Like, that's a descriptive word. That does not give us the actual why the patient is there. So the main term here would be peritonitis, and then that descriptive of what type of peritonitis it is would be the subterm of streptococcal. So my main term, cap locks, is peritonitis, and the subterm in this case is the strep. So let's try this next one. Dermatitis due to an allergy. So while you could be seen in an office because of allergies, this due to allergies is describing how the why occurred. So our main term would be dermatitis, and then the subterm is due to allergies. And then the last one, the gastroduodenal ulceration. So why is the patient here? Well, this gastroduodenal is the anatomic site. It's not why they're there. Everyone has it. But the why the patient is there is because they have ulceration of that anatomic site. So the gastroduodenal would be the subterm. Okay, next one. I try to find the main term, then I go look for the ICD-10 and it says something else, not even matching the diagnosis. So this could be one of two reasons. It would be helpful if you gave me the example. However, it's either because we have to trust the index, which is something that is discussed in chapter 2. It's also something I discussed last week. Or it is because it is a medical term difference. So, for example, um, you may see in a medical record that it says a patient has rosacea. But then when you look in the ICD-10 manual, it says adult onset acne. So you need to know that sometimes the medical term knowledge is what's going to help you. All right. And the last question is again the same thing from last week. Are there any websites or videos I recommend for extra visuals? I do not recommend any extra ones. Of course, there are great videos out there on YouTube, but I do not want to recommend them because I have recommended them in the past, and students then say, I am teaching by showing YouTubes and it has backfired for me. So, unfortunately, I do not share videos or websites, but I can tell you going to a HEMA is always a good place for website purposes because we work through a lot of stuff on a HEMA. And then if there are specific examples or terminology or things that you're unsure of, I am happy to do any extra videos. You just have to provide me with what you want me to discuss. So basically, the students drive the course and what I lecture on. Okay, So before we go into these examples, I want to show you the importance of guidelines. The guidelines are like the code Bible basically, because it tells you a lot about when you need to use a specific code or when you need additional codes. And if you look in the very front of your manual, you'll see that there are general coding guidelines. And we talked about those when we were talking about conventions. These general coding guidelines apply to every single code in the manual. Talks about multiple coding, acute and chronic conditions, combination coding. This is where we get a lot of our sequencing information, which code goes first, which code goes second. But we also have chapter specific guidelines. There are 22 chapters in our ICD 10 CM manual, and there are specific rules and information about almost every single one of those chapters. This week, we are going to look at chapters 18, 20, and 21 specifically, but there are obviously other chapters as well. We will continue looking at multiple chapters throughout this entire quarter. But let's talk about the first one that um, is in our reading for this week, and that is chapter 18. And this one is something that you should write down somewhere because there will be a question on this in your advanced coding course. In fact, there's multiple questions on this in your advanced coding course. There will be questions on your certification exam for sure. And as long as you remember these few things, you'll be good. Okay, so right now we are specifically talking about chapter 18 in the ICD 10 CM manual, and it is for signs and symptoms. Again, there are a few rules here. So, first thing is we only use these codes if there is no definitive diagnosis. So, that needs to be memorized. Only use when no definitive diagnosis. With that being said, I am going to put a little caveat on there. There are times where a patient has symptoms that isn't related to the definitive diagnosis. So if symptoms are not related to the definitive diagnosis, you can code them too. But most of the time, we do not code signs and symptoms unless they are the only thing that occurred. So there is no formal diagnosis. So what codes we'll find in here all begin with an R. That is something to remember because that is a sneaky way that you can sometimes, when you're taking your certification exam, throw out answers because they're multiple choice. If you see that some of the answers have R codes in them, you should immediately know that R codes that start with an R are for signs, symptoms, or abnormal results. and again are only used if there's no definitive diagnosis. This commonly occurs in outpatient or early diagnostic settings. So, the third thing is we are allowed to use these as principal diagnosis. So, can be used as first listed diagnosis. So, if we have a patient presents with a fever and vomiting. Let's do it this way. Fever and vomiting. These are symptoms of something. We don't know what they're symptoms of yet. So we would use a code, a code that starts with R for the fever. In fact, that's R50.9. Don't worry, you don't have to memorize that. I just memorize codes because I've been doing this for a while. And then R1 1.10 is for vomiting. And we code both of these to describe the symptoms. However, if we had a patient that came in that says, patient presents with fever and vomiting, and then the assessment told us in the medical record that the patient has viral, let's say, gastroenteritis. A fever and vomiting are common symptoms of viral gastroenteritis. This is our definitive diagnosis code. This means we would only code for this viral gastroenteritis. We would not include the fever and the vomiting R codes. Doing so would be incorrect. It would get the question wrong on your certification exam. And if you were submitting it to an insurance company, they would either kick it back or they would want to know why you were coding for something that has already been established as being symptoms of this more definitive diagnosis. Okay, so that's chapter 18. Let's go to chapter 20. Okay, so if we flip to chapter 20, we will see that chapter 20 is external causes of morbidity. So, the first thing that we need to know is these are things that happen outside of the body. So, oops. Think of falling down the stairs and breaking your arm. You didn't break your arm because of something that was going on inside your body. You broke your arm because you fell down the stairs. Falling down the stairs is an external cause. So, a couple of things that we need to know about these codes. First one is they are never coded as first listed codes. 2, they identify identify the cause of the injury. They also talk about the intent of the injury. Was it accidental? Was it a suicide attempt? There are also codes for the place of occurrence that that external thing happened. Also, the activity of what was happening. Was the patient walking, running, working? And then any other external factors. So, what's important here in this guideline area is that you understand that you're going to have multiple codes. And these guidelines tell us that. So, for example, if you read place of occurrence codes, it says here are place of occurrence codes. They tell you where the external cause took place. Then you have these activity codes. They explain what was going on, and it tells you that any information that you have would need to be included. So if you go to this next one here, place of occurrence, activity, and status codes. So, when applicable, you are always going to have the place of occurrence, the activity that was happening, the external cause status code, and they are going to be sequenced after the main external cause code. So let's talk about that. So let's say that we have a patient that was driving their car to the school to pick up their child. When at the school, she got a flat tire, and when changing the tire, um, got a laceration on her hand that was repaired with simple closure and was 5.0 centimeters. Okay, so we're going to have a couple of codes. First code we're going to have is the laceration. That's the actual thing that happened to the hand. Second code we're going to have is going to be for the activity. So she was changing her tire. It was at her child's school. And what was the other thing that we need to do? Place of occurrence, we said, was at school. Changing the tire was activity. External cause status. So her laceration was from changing the tire at school. We would need to have all three of these codes, possibly more, because we would read the notes in the tabular. to correctly code this case. So those are codes from chapter 20. The last chapter that we're going to look at this week is chapter 21. These are Z codes. These are where we're going to have encounters for providing additional information about a patient encounter. So, chapter 21 is where we're going to have our Z codes, and some of these can be primary listed codes or first listed codes. And basically, the things that you're going to find in here is when patients have a service but are not currently ill. So, like, well baby, um, pregnancy, like routine visits. Also, ongoing treatment, such as occupational therapy, physical therapy, chemo, and also vaccinations or history. So, vaccination, like when you get a vaccination, and both personal and family history of a disease. So if I had family history of colon cancer and I was at the gastroenterologist having services related to possibly having colon cancer, this family history of colon cancer Z code would be listed. And that would help ensure that we have all of the information for the insurance company and to make sure we get reimbursed. All right, let's try to do a couple from these chapters. Okay, so let's start off with this 50-year-old patient presents to the ED with ringing in the ears, nausea, vomiting, and drowsiness. Do you see a definitive diagnosis here? I do not. I see some symptoms, but I do not see any definitive diagnosis. So, we are going to look for a diagnosis code for these 4 items. Let's start with the first one. Let's start with ringing in the ears. So let's go to our book, and the why the patient is here is ringing or ring. So let's look that up in our index. Remember, you can always pause these videos if I'm going too fast for you. You can pause and, unpause to catch up. Okay, so if I look for ring or ringing, I am on page 290. I see rings. I don't see anything that says ringing in the ear. I see ringed hair. I see ringworm, but I don't see anything about ringing in the ear. This is an example of us needing to know our medical terminology. So we can't find ringing of the ears. So if we know our medical terminology or our A&P, we know that tinnitus or tinnitus, depending on how you pronounce it, is the medical term for ringing in the ear or sound in the ear. So now let's look up that main term in our book. And we will find that on page 325. TINN. There we go. The last column here. We see tinnitus, NOS, which is not otherwise specified, meaning it's not descriptive of audible, aurum, pulsative, or subjective. So because we don't have any of these subterms, we are going to go for the generic, not otherwise specified code. So again, I'm on page 325. There is no subterm. I'm still on page 325. There are no conventions. Well, actually, I guess there is because there's a dash, because we will need additional digits. And that is H93.1 dash. H93.1 dash. So that tells me that I am going to need more than the codes that are listed there. So I need to now verify that code in the tabular. So I go to the tabular and I find H93.1. Remember, it's in alphabetic and then numeric order. H93.1. At the very end here on page 682, we find that H93.1 at the very tippy top. And our fifth digit choices are right ear, left ear, bilateral, or unspecified ear. So it says here ringing in the ears. So that would mean bilateral. It said both ears, you only have two, so bilateral. So yes, we do need an additional character. We do not need to go to anywhere else because there are notes that tell us that we need to add a 3 as our fifth character. Now that only describes the ringing of the ears. We still have to discuss nausea, vomiting, and drowsiness. So let's now go and look at the main term of nausea. And I'm going to do this without the form but I'm still going to provide the same information. So we are going to look up nausea as our main term. And we could do this another way too. We could look up all of the codes in the index first, all the main terms in the index first, and then go to the tabular for all of them. I like to go back and forth personally, but it's not incorrect if you want to just look up all the codes in the index first and then go verify them all at the end. That is okay to do as well. All right. NAU. And yes, I do have to spell and sing the alphabet in my ear a couple times. All right. Nausea is on page 241. And we see nausea without vomiting or with vomiting. Our example said they are nauseous with vomiting. So my subterm is with vomiting and gives me code R11.2. There are no conventions, but this does hit two of the diagnoses, the nausea and the vomiting. You see here that this starts with an R, so it is a sign and symptom. This one did not start with an R because tinnitus is not just a sign or symptom. That can actually be a definitive diagnosis. You can have tinnitus as a diagnosis. Okay, so we are going to look up that R code now in the tabular. R11.2. And R11.2 is on page 982. Okay, and when we read R11.2, we see nausea with vomiting unspecified. No conventions telling us we need additional digits or codes. Also says that you may see in the medical record it's a persistent nausea with vomiting not otherwise specified. But we do not need any additional code. So these two are now done. Now we need to find a code for drowsiness. We are going to look under the main term of drowsiness. And in the index, that is on page 130. On the bottom of the first column on page 130, you will see drowsiness, R40.0. So again, that was on page 130. I am now going to verify this code in the tabular. R40.0 is on the bottom of page 985. And you will see, you will see another word there. So you will see somnolence, which is another term for drowsiness. This is an example of one of the questions. What if we look up the diagnosis and it is something different in the index or in the tabular? So this is an example of that. If you look up somnolence, it will tell you that it is drowsiness. So not only is it listed there, but it is also a trust the index kind of thing if drowsiness wasn't listed. So now we got 3 codes. We have this H93.13. We have that R11.2 and R40.0. Here's the tricky part. For sequencing purposes, there are no rules for signs and symptoms. For everything else, there are. But in this case, if this was an example on your assignment, you would put them in the order that they are on the question. So because this was listed first, ringing of the ears, then the nausea and vomiting, then the drowsiness, but that is only for signs and symptoms. Everyone else has a rule of how to sequence. Okay, and finally, let's look at this case. Mrs. Keating presents today for a routine screening baseline mammogram of both breasts with CAD, computer aided detection. So, why is the patient being seen? So, some may say, oh, the reason that they're being seen is because of a mammogram. Well, that's actually the procedure. The reason that they are being seen is because they are being screened. That is our main term for this example. So anytime you see screening, that would be your best bet as your main term. So let's take a look in our index under screen or screening. And we see screening start on page 296. I'm just going to write this down. So we looked at screening, and page 296 is where we saw screening begin. And we're looking for screening for the breast or mammogram. So screening for, and we're going to keep looking until we see something that says either mammogram or breast. So screening, I do not see mammogram or breast. So the reason we do screenings of or mammograms of the breast is to check to see if a patient has neoplasms or not. So I had to go to a different place. So under screening, I first looked for breast. I didn't see it. I then looked for mammogram. I didn't see it, but I know that one of the things that you are doing when you are screening or doing a mammogram is to check for a neoplasm, which means check for cancer. So I looked under neoplasm and then look at that. I see breast and then routine mammogram. So underneath neoplasm, I found breast and then routine mammogram. And I found Z12.31. Z12.31. Oops. Now I'm going to go look this up in our tabular and see if it makes sense for that screening that occurred. So Z12 is on page 1315. 1231 says in counter for a screening mammogram for malignant neoplasm of the breast. So, what does that mean? That means that there is not currently a malignant neoplasm. There is not currently cancer. We are screening to see if there is cancer. If there was a malignant neoplasm and we were doing a diagnostic mammogram, it would be a different code. Okay, so I went to page 1315 and verified that this code is correct. So this will be my answer in the assignment, if this is one that's on the assignment. Now, one more thing that I want to talk about before I wrap this up is you may have seen that there are notes or guidelines that actually present before each of the chapters. While most of this is duplicate from what's in the beginning of the manual, it does have some additional examples. So this may be something that you want to review if you are unsure of sequencing or laterality or other items that you may have questions on related to guidelines and the conventions. All right, that is it for this week. Thank you so much for joining.